Hello there, and welcome to the Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Susie Bridges, and I'm going to be talking with you today about working with productive skills. So this is what I'm planning on covering today. So chatting a little bit about some problems and solutions with the different productive skills, and then looking at the speaking and the writing lesson frameworks so that you can deliver this kind of lesson either as an add-on or as a standalone kind of 30-40 minute lesson with your learners. And of course, it's always useful to have practical suggestions. So hopefully we'll be covering a few of those as well. So let's go. So if we think about how much students naturally speak, typically that's going to be in language lessons or in receptive skills lessons. So if we think about how they speak in language lessons, often the aim of the speaking isn't just for conversation practice, it's accuracy, isn't it? Because we want them to think about using the target language. So they're going to be doing controlled practice activities, so maybe some drilling, or maybe some gap filling, and then just using those conversations together with each other, because you want to build their confidence using the target language. And then even when they move across to freer practice, they're still going to be quite restricted in what they can say, because again, the idea is that we want them just to practice examples of using the target language. It's possible they may make mistakes in other areas of vocabulary or pronunciation, but probably the teacher isn't looking out for things like that. The teacher is only going to correct any mistakes they make with the new language. So that can be a problem if we want the students to work on using fluency in real-world situations. If we think about then why students speak in receptive skills lessons, so that's if they've been doing a little bit of reading or a little bit of listening, realistically, they don't get much opportunity to speak, do they? Because the text takes up the majority of the lesson. So possibly they might have a couple of minutes of speaking during the lead-in when you're doing an introduction to the topic of whatever the listening or the reading is about. Of course, hopefully you'll remember to allow them to build their confidence using pair work and checking answers together with other students. And then maybe if the teacher is really good at time management, I have to admit there are days that I'm great and days when I'm not so great, maybe the conversation is cut a little bit short because you're worried about finishing the lesson on time. And so therefore, the students may not even get any feedback or any help with any of the language they've been producing during that last speaking task of the lesson. So this is why I think it's really important that we need to deliver just speaking lessons in order for the students to be given an opportunity to really practice getting a conversation going, especially if they're thinking about doing an exam. Because of course, when they're doing a speaking exam, some of the criteria they're assessed on will be things like fluency. So have the students had an opportunity to maybe have a conversation for 3 to 5 minutes? If they're not used to doing that, maybe they're going to be quite hesitant when they speak, or maybe be quite unsure of themselves and maybe repeat some of the same things, so not scoring highly on that particular criteria. And then what about their content? We mentioned in grammar lessons, they normally only use the target language. What about giving them opportunities to practice a wider range of vocabulary or a wider range of grammatical structures? And also, if we don't do the error correction, how do the learners then know if their sentences are error-free? Obviously, we want them to make sure they're doing the best they can in exams, so the content and the error correction are really important. And so the only thing that we might sometimes give students a little bit of feedback on is their pronunciation. Is their accent intelligible? Are they speaking with natural tone rather than kind of the quite clipped robotic English? So these are some reasons why it's a really good idea to give your students opportunities to develop their speaking skills in our classroom. So there are a number of different problems that students might have when you're trying to get them to speak. So we're looking here at the pink problems. So if the students aren't clear about what they're doing, that can be a problem for them because they don't really know what to say. Another problem can be that they don't have much information about the topic. And we're going to talk about this both for speaking and for writing, because it's those productive skills we want to work on, not necessarily challenging or testing the students' imaginative ability. So really, we as teachers want to be giving them some input and doing some brainstorming in the class to make sure that the students have got something that they think it's important to say. Sometimes instructions to speaking skills can be lost, so the students aren't sure what to do. So in the framework I'm going to show you, there are clear instructions, or there's a section for clear instructions, so you can make sure the learners are fully set up and they know exactly what they're doing step by step. Sometimes, depending on personality, your students could be a bit embarrassed or a bit shy. So we want to try and make the activity motivating, engaging, and fun, maybe considering what the students are interested in. So that could be music, that could be sport, maybe using some of their heroes for role plays, for example. And we want to also make sure that we're being really sensitive to personalities when we're thinking about classroom dynamics. Sometimes it can work really, really well if you put dominant, strong students together so they can have a good old chin wag. Because if you put a dominant student together with maybe a weaker, less confident student, then it's very likely that that dominant student is going to take over the conversation, and the quieter, shyer student doesn't really get the same opportunity to speak. So sometimes it can be really good to put two quiet people together, because then they can have a conversation where both are allowed to give similar kind of input. And of course, students might not speak because they don't have the words, they don't have the language. So we want to try as teachers to provide them with situations or with pictures where that language just naturally appears, giving them a little bit of confidence to work on their speaking skills. So these are all some examples of the solutions to the problems that students experience with speaking skills. Okay, moving on. This just looks like the basic framework for giving a speaking skills lesson. So you're probably very familiar with stages like the lead-in, where you're just warming up the students' brains, getting them ready for the activity. And the important thing to think about in this framework is making sure that you've got a suitable stimulus and giving students plenty of thinking or preparation time. So let's have a look at what this might look like if we were doing a demo lesson itself. So when you're thinking about your planning process, I've got the plan just here to the side, so we can have a look at the different stages of the lesson and make sure that we're following the framework. So if I was doing this as just a full speaking lesson, just working on the productive skill of speaking, I'd expect this to be taking sort of 40 to 45 minutes, which is a typical time for a lesson. So you could either run this lesson as a 45-minute speaking lesson, or maybe you could knock it down to 30 minutes and add it onto the end of maybe something they were doing with the text first. So I would show my students these two pictures, and my lead-in would be asking them to talk about what they can see. So maybe discussing nationalities or ages or anything else they can see that could be interesting to them about these two different pictures. So the stimulus is basically the reason why I want my students to speak. So in this particular sample lesson, the question of the lesson is going to be, why am I famous? So looking at these two individuals and getting the learners to have a think about, why might these two people be famous? So the next most important part of a speaking skills lesson is that you really want to make sure that you're giving your students adequate preparation time, and that might also mean building in some thinking time. So you know your learners best, and you can maybe make a decision about whether or not this is best done alone, or whether it's best done together as a class, as a brainstorming activity. So you'd be thinking together about maybe some questions a reporter might ask them to find out why they were famous. So basic questions would obviously include things like the name, the age, the nationality. Based on the ages of the people, we might want to get them to talk about what they did before, if maybe now they're retired. Maybe they're not retired, so what do they do now? Are they famous because they hold a world record? And if not, why are they famous? So these would all be some really good ideas that we could feed into the class to get the students starting to think about why their particular person might be famous. And of course, if you're doing it together, you'd be taking examples from the students as well. So hopefully you'd be able to build up quite a nice pile of brainstorming suggestions to help them. So before the speaking task starts, you want to make sure that your students have got clear instructions. So the thinking time you can do together as a class. The preparation time we'll be allowing the students maybe 3 to 5 minutes to just jot down some notes to support them while they're speaking. Even though it's a speaking lesson, there's no problem with the students just having a couple of bullet points to help them, or a few half sentences as an aide memoir, because we can't expect them, especially at lower levels, to try to remember 6 or 7 pieces of information all at once. So we would give our students clear instructions about taking their notes with them and who they would be working with for the initial speaking task, and then maybe some instructions about how to move them on when we want them to do the speaking task again. So the speaking activity ideally would take place 2 or 3 times. What we want the students to do is have their confidence built up, so that as they're speaking, the information that they're saying is going deeper. So the next time they do the talking task with a new person, they feel a bit more confident about what it is that they're doing. The idea behind repeating the speaking task a couple of times is either to get the students to develop fluency because they have become more confident in what they're saying, or if they are quite a confident learner, allowing them the opportunity to maybe switch roles halfway through. So they're using the same questions, but they're now thinking about a different person, and maybe coming up with answers ad hoc or on the spot. So this way, the speaking activity itself might end up taking a good 10 to 15 minutes. At lower levels, we wouldn't expect the students to be able to hold and sustain a 10-minute conversation, but they can certainly hold a 3-minute conversation 2 or 3 times. So this is the kind of thing we'd be aiming at by getting the students to speak to a number of different people, either in breakout rooms or moving in different tables if you're in a physical environment, so that the rehearsal every time they speak means that they become more and more fluent. And also that's great for you as a teacher, because then you can start collecting some errors for when you move into the feedback stage. So if the students have had a good 10 or 15 minutes of talking time with a number of different people, when you're doing the feedback, I like to break the feedback down into 2 different stages. So you'll see that over here on the planning side. First of all, doing something that we call content feedback. So the content feedback is really important because the students have just been chatting for 10, 12, 15 minutes. And as teachers, we really want to acknowledge and validate the work they've been doing for us. Imagine how demotivating it would be if you've just spent 15 minutes chatting and then your teacher says, okay, stop the activity, look at all the mistakes you made. That might be quite sad for them. So we really want to work on focusing on the content first. So for example, Magdalena, I heard you say that your lady was famous for being the oldest person on the cover of a fashion magazine. That sounds interesting. Which fashion magazine is that? Or it might be, Ahmed, you were talking about your guy holding the world record for eating the most amount of noodles with chopsticks. Tell us how quick he was. So that way we're proving to the students that we listened and we heard what it was they were talking about. And if you as the teacher can start that content conversation by picking up on 1 or 2 of what the students have said, that really gives them that feeling of like, oh, my teacher was listening and she liked what I was saying. So I think the content feedback is super important. Never forget to comment on what it is that the students have just been talking about. And then when you think you've got a good sense of everybody sharing in the classroom, or depending on the size of the classroom, maybe just 2 or 3 people sharing, then we can move on to talk about error correction. So of course, as the students were chatting, we'd want to note down a couple of their errors that we can then prepare on a slide or on the board, and allow the students an opportunity to have a look at the errors and maybe self-correct first. But we also maybe want to use this as an opportunity to level up the language. So when you were listening, maybe you heard a student express themselves and you can think of a much clearer way they could say that expression in English. Or maybe if they're using very, very similar vocabulary. Oh yes, you know, he's a nice man, he lives in a nice town, he has a nice family. Maybe you want to do a bit of brainstorming with other synonyms connected with nice, like amazing or wonderful or interesting, so that you're not just keeping your students static at the level. When you're doing error correction or language feedback, you're also trying to get them to think about leveling up. So if you use this planning process when you're doing your speaking skills lessons, it should be really straightforward to encourage the learners to be speaking for a good amount of time. As I say, 10 to 15 minutes should be what you're aiming for, provided that you've put in the scaffolding in place before the lesson to support them with the prep time, and then spending a little bit of time afterwards talking about the content of what they're saying and also giving them some error correction. So this is one example of a typical speaking skills lesson that you could do. And here are some other suggestions that you can do in order to work on the student's fluency. So there's loads of different ideas there. Some you may have come across before, maybe some are new for you. If you've got any questions about these, you can just put them in the chat box in the forum and we can address these in the live session. But giving students things like problem solving activities. So there's a very famous one in one of Penny Ehr's book where the students have to reorganize a zoo. So there are pictures of cages with different animals inside, and then you're given a list of constraints. So for example, the wolves can't go next to the deer because they're natural predators and prey. You don't want the monkeys near the cafeteria because they're noisy and stinky and they want to throw food. So the problem solving activity for the students is then to have a blank template of the zoo cages and then discuss together in a group why they think different animals should be in different places according to the specific constraints that they get given. So this kind of thing is quite fun because it has an outcome. And an outcome is really important for students so that they feel like they've achieved something. They're not just speaking for speaking's sake. Similar with things like ranking activities, together you might want to brainstorm the 10 best qualities for a teacher, for example, and then have the students rank those qualities in order of importance. So is it better that your teacher is really friendly, or should patience be the number one criteria, or do you think that their knowledge of language should be the most important thing? So students can have like a little battle about different opinions. And of course, you do need to make sure that in the input stage, you've worked with the students on conversational gambits, like how to agree or how to disagree, or maybe even how to politely interrupt. Okay, all these things are really important when you're giving your students tools to be able to work on fluency tasks in classes. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the writing part of the lesson. So if you think about some typical things that you normally write, probably they fall into these kinds of categories. You're probably text messaging people every day. Maybe you might write a shopping list to yourself if you're popping around the shops. Maybe you might leave a note on the fridge saying buy milk or something for your partner. So these kinds of things tend to be very, very short, just a few words. And of course, when we're using text speak, it's very common that we don't even use words, that we go down to abbreviations like the letter C and the letter U, and then later might be written with a number in the middle. It could be that you're writing emails to friends or emails for work, and the length of these could vary from just 2 or 3 sentences to something more approaching a letter kind of length. And then maybe depending on your job, you might be writing reports or essays. If you're a student, you might be writing assignments. If you're fresh off your CELTA, you're probably used to writing assignments and maybe also working with lesson plans. So these are the kinds of things that we typically write in L1 or our mother tongue. And then let's think about the kind of things that we ask students to write. So just take a quick 20 seconds to think about what students might write. Let's see if any of your ideas are the same as my ideas. Okay, so in classrooms, the students typically are going to be writing answers in gaps, maybe filling out answers to comprehension questions from doing a listening. It's quite common that maybe they get to write postcards. And then if they're working towards one of the exams, they might also need to write reports or articles, maybe blogs, maybe emails. But if we think about this list, it's quite different to what we naturally write in L1. So it might be really challenging to expect the students to produce lengthy amounts of work in L2 when they don't even write those things in L1. The other problem, of course, is now that we're in the 21st century, you can see a neglected pencil case here. So maybe the students aren't even used to handwriting. They might find it really difficult just to hold a pen and decide where things go on paper because they're so used to using tablets or laptops or phones. So as teachers, we have to really think about that And then depending on the level, it's really important that we build the students' confidence by working on the different writing sub-skills. So if we think back to the first kind of thing that we write, like text messages, shopping lists, or notes to a partner or a friend, this is kind of working on the writing sub-skill at word level. So this is all about, what do the students need in order to be able to write a word? So we have to think about getting them to practice handwriting, making sure that they understand the relationship on a line between letters in English that might go up above the line or letters that might go down the line. This could be a problem for some people from different nationalities because the direction in which they write in L1 could be very different from the way that we write in English. So the directionality could be a problem for some students who are learning to write. They might have issues with hand-eye coordination. And certainly, I'm sure you've all had the same experience about spelling. Just because a word sounds a certain way, that doesn't necessarily give you any clue in English as to how it's going to be pronounced. So the spelling and the letter formation might be a problem for students at word level. So before we can expect them to create sentences, we might want to do some basic work on words. In order then to create a sentence, our students are going to need to put some words together in order to be able to make a sentence. So for that, they're obviously going to need some language. They're going to need to use some nouns and some verbs. And at the higher levels, we really want to make sure that we're encouraging them to use a range of vocabulary and a range of different tenses. So think about that when you're teaching. And if you're introducing vocabulary, maybe you could introduce a couple of synonyms to an adjective that you're teaching. Maybe you could think about teaching dependent prepositions so that the students know how the word would appear in a sentence. So for example, interested commonly appears with in after it. So I'm interested in art, or I'm interested in sport. You might also want to think about the word order. Adjectives and nouns have different relationships in different countries. So in the UK, I might have a small red car, but in other countries, it might be a car red small. So the word order is really important. So paying attention to syntax when you're teaching students at sentence level is key. And when we're looking at things on the board, we as teachers should make sure we're modeling accurate pronunciation. So teaching vocabulary only using lowercase, not uppercase, because students might think then random words like, I don't know, table or hamburger have a capital letter, when in English they don't. In other languages, for example, in German, they do. So if we're modeling capital letters for the students, they're going to take that away as a model, and we don't want to teach them wrong things. Similarly, if you're writing sentences on the board or questions on the board especially, remember your accurate punctuation. Model the fact that your sentence or your question starts with a capital letter, and then of course you have to finish it with a full stop or a question mark. And then if we want the students to work up to writing exams where they're going to be doing essays or reports or articles, they need to be able to put sentences together in order to form texts. So they're going to need to understand about what a paragraph is, and therefore how to write a topic sentence to introduce a paragraph. They need to understand about register and genre. So the way that we might write a blog, for example, is different from the way that we might write a report. A newspaper article might have a different style from an email that you're writing to your friend. So we've not only got to think about how the text is organized, how it's laid out, but the style of the student's writing. Who's the audience? Who are they writing for? And then does the text stick together? Do the paragraphs flow nicely? Is the style cohesive? Or are they just making a mess of things because they don't understand about how to start a paragraph, how to make conclusions? So we also need to think about teaching them things like discourse markers. So firstly, secondly, on the other hand, moreover, these kinds of things will be really important if your learners are moving on to take one of the typical exams. So here I've just got a little picture of something that you might want to do to give the students for homework if they're struggling at word level. I find often people from Arabic speaking countries really need some support with their handwriting. And it's like running. The more you run, the faster you get. So you could give them little tracing activities to do for homework, and that way they'll hopefully not lag too far behind in the class. So here you can see things like there's a little start spot and also a directionality arrow to show students how to create a little A. Often these days, we're not going to come across illiterate students, but if the language of the students has a very different alphabet, if it's not a Roman script, they may need a little bit of help and support on things like this. So thinking particularly about your Arabic speaking learners or your students who are at lower levels, in order to build their confidence, there are a couple of things that we can help them with. So one of these things I call parallel writing tasks. So that's basically like a copying activity, but allowing for a little bit of personalization to make the sentence more interesting and more relevant for the students. So you can see here in black, what we do is I live in Bournemouth, which is near the sea. So this is my example sentence, which is true for me. So this is what I would show my students. And then I would want them to start recognizing what kind of word Bournemouth is. So hopefully my students might know this is a proper noun. So I can put my proper noun in red because this can be changed if you don't live in Bournemouth. And then I can also think about the place, the location. So for this example, I've got near the sea. So I would encourage my students to highlight the whole of that phrase, because then they can replace it with something that might be true for them. So you can see here that they're replacing the proper noun Bournemouth with Seoul, which will be true for my Korean learners. And then rather than saying Seoul is near the sea, they're changing that. They're keeping the basic syntax, they're keeping the basic structure of the sentence, which is, but they're changing the part that's relevant for them. So instead of saying, I live in Seoul, which is near the sea, they're changing the sentence to make it true for them. So it's parallel to the model sentence, but it's personalized to give them the opportunity and the confidence to change things to make it true for them. So this kind of activity works really well with the lower level learners, especially because you can start introducing things like syntax. You wouldn't call it syntax necessarily with your lower level learners, but you would say things like, for example, the place goes at the end. Or if you're teaching time, I've lived in Bournemouth for 10 years, then you would teach them that for 10 years is a time expression, which you could change for 2 weeks or 2 months or however long it is. And again, that prepositions of time normally live near the end of sentences. So the parallel writing tasks are nice and simple, nice and basic, so they're achievable for your learners, but you can also get a bit of sneaky grammar in there, which is great. And again, this kind of thing is good for practicing different adjectives. So I could look at the example that my student has given me. I live in Seoul, which is a big city. And now I might say to them, okay, that's great. Now change the adjective. So instead of a big city, they might say an expensive city, for example. So we also can help students with picture prompts. I find sometimes that, especially if your students have come together in a class, if they're a closed cohort, they might not do very much in the evenings or weekends. So whenever you're trying to encourage that bit of friendly chat, it might just stop dead at teacher saying, what did you do at the weekend? And the student saying, I was with my friends. And then stopping. So what we as teachers want to do is help them practice their language. And we can do that by providing some pictures. I used to do this with a group of fantastic learners that I had, and I would challenge them to come up with the most crazy, outrageous, weird and wonderful weekend ideas, just to give them practice of using different vocabulary so it wasn't the same expressions all the time. So we could say things like, at the weekend I went shopping, or I watched a movie with some friends, or I went to McDonald's for lunch, or I Skyped with my family on Sunday. So even just by providing a couple of typical pictures, this might spark your students' own ideas, own interests, and they might start including things like, oh, we played football on Saturday, or we played cards on the weekend. So picture prompts might be something that your learners need. Depending on the learners, you might also want to give them writing prompts. You can do this at any level. And again, things like prepositions tend to be quite tricky for students. So try and chunk information together, and then they're not making mistakes like at Saturday. Okay, they can learn that it's on Friday or on Friday night. So you're not teaching that as 3 separate words. You're teaching it as one chunk. So all the students have to remember is, on Friday night, I watched a movie with some friends. Or on Saturday, I went. And then you could teach them some common verbs that take go. So for example, go for a run, go for a jog, go for a swim, go for a walk, go shopping. So you can do a combination of prompts and also parallel writing to help the students expand and improve their vocabulary. I find that a lot of my students seem to end up in McDonald's, no matter where they come from. So I included McDonald's here, but of course they can change that for any fast food restaurant they want, or maybe even things like at the weekend, I cooked. So that's also another opportunity to help them practice expanding their vocabulary. So then just to summarize, to help the students at lower levels, we can give them parallel sentences practice, we can give them picture prompts, and we can give them either half sentences as prompts, or maybe another thing that you can do, this tends to work better with the higher levels, is give them just keyword prompts so that students get to reconstruct a sentence. So I might show them these pictures, for example, and give them these word prompts, and I'd be trying to get them to say things like, after the course, there was a champagne celebration. Or it could be, after the course, she opened a bottle of champagne to celebrate. So this way, I can say to the students, you can use part of the word family. So it doesn't have to be the noun celebration, for example. I'd be happy with the word celebrate. Maybe including things like collocation. So a bottle of champagne or a glass of champagne, not a mug of champagne or a packet of champagne. Success, again, thinking about word families. So the students achieved success, or the students were given certificates because they were successful. So playing around with different word families can be a really useful thing for your students. And then also we want to try to make sure that it's personalized as much as possible. So it could be, for example, when I celebrate, I like to drink champagne and eat a kebab. So the students would have to make that true for themselves. So when I'm celebrating, I have a big dinner with my family. Or when I'm celebrating, we don't have champagne, but we go to a nice restaurant. So all of these things are ideas for what you can do to support your lower level learners with their writing skills. So let's have a think then about the higher level learners. Just before I do the reveal, again, I'll give you maybe 10 or 20 seconds. Have a think about what higher level learners might need. Okay, so with your higher level learners, what they might need is going to be very different from what your lower level learners need. At the higher levels, we're expecting them to have the word and the sentence sub-skills down. What they might not be doing, though, is being accurate. So before we start teaching them more difficult vocabulary or more difficult grammatical structures like future perfect or the conditionals, we want to make sure that the basic building blocks of their grammar are correct. So we want to be teaching them to proofread and self-correct, because very often if you underline mistakes in, for example, the present perfect or the past simple, they know that the past simple of see is saw or the present participle is seen. But sometimes when they're writing, their hand is just working faster than their brain. If we teach them to go back to proofread, to edit and correct, we can try to get them to work on their accuracy. It's much better if they're taking an exam for them to be using simple but accurate language rather than overstretching themselves and making tons and tons of mistakes with complex grammar. If they can get the basics to be accurate, that's going to give them a solid foundation that the improved vocabulary and the wider range of tenses can then work on. We want to make sure that they are able to organize information correctly. So this is your things like discourse markers, your connectors like although, as a result of, despite. We want to make sure that they can use a range of different discourse markers so that there's pointers throughout the text of where the students are going and the reader can find it much easier to follow. We also want to make sure they understand the difference between speaking versus writing, or writing an SMS message as opposed to writing a formal email. They need to be able to understand the genre. So if I'm writing a newspaper article, for example, I might not use the first person pronoun. I did this, I did that. Normally in newspaper articles, the passive is much more common, especially with use of the present perfect. So 4 people were arrested instead of I arrested 4 people. So they need to know about things like that. And then as they're writing and their confidence improves, within the class time, you also want to make sure that you're giving them some timed writing practice so that they can work on finishing a task within maybe the 20 minutes that they might get allocated in an exam. Okay, so at the higher levels, we assume that their word and sentence level skills are okay, but it's these different things that your learners need to work on in order to get them from okay to much better. So again, now thinking about what a writing lesson might look like. Sometimes in a lesson, depending on if you're working to a 45-minute timetable or maybe an hour and 20-minute timetable, you might get so far down the lesson framework. Typically, when we're teaching writing skills, it normally comes after they've seen a model of some kind. So let's think about what that might look like in a lesson plan, in a skills sample lesson. So I've got the planning process written down here. As we look at the stages, we can just check and tick off the different sections that I'm using. So I'm keeping my same pictures, and part of this is to show you that I really believe in exploiting your material. So really squeezing the maximum you can out of material. It's good for the students because they can become confident with vocabulary that they're already using because of the last time you taught them. And also because they can get their imaginations go a bit crazy because they might start to feel like they know the character. Of course, depending on your lesson, on your learners and the level of the lesson, you might want to introduce different pictures, and that's fine as well. But let's imagine in the course book, there's an article saying, for example, my grandma is my hero. So first of all, we would do a lead-in, the same as we would for every other lessons. So getting the students to have a look at and have a chat about what they can see. If it's going to be a reading activity, it's probably a good idea to pre-teach just maybe 2 or 3 words that the students need in order to be able to fully understand what they're reading about. It's not a vocab lesson, so no more than 2 or 3 words maximum, and just the key words that they need to help them answer 2 or 3 questions on the text. So that would be your reading for gist stage. You really want to make sure the questions are quite generic and easy to answer. We're not going to work on depth of comprehension in this kind of lesson. We just want the students to see a model of something that they're then going to copy when they do their own writing. So the start of a writing skills lesson framework is the same as for a reading or a listening lesson. Typically, though, for a writing lesson, it's going to be something that they read, and then they've got that reading text there as a model to help them move forward. So once they've understood what they're reading about, the next stage is to analyze what kind of text it was. So what did they read? Was it a newspaper article? Was it a blog? Was it advice on TripAdvisor, on social media? Something that the student needs to be able to understand that makes what they've read typical for the kind of text that they're looking at. So this is where we'd be looking at the key features. So as I mentioned, for the newspaper article, using the passive is really common, or not using I as a pronoun, maybe if you're doing an interview, or if you're writing an interview, maybe the format might be question, answer, instead of a block of text like you might get if you were writing a story. So the genre analysis is really key in the writing skills framework to make sure your students understand what it is they've been reading, and therefore what it is about that model that they need to understand in order to then be able to do the writing task themselves. And so before we get them to do the writing, we want to give them a reason to write. We want to give them motivation or stimulus, okay? Students always need a reason to write. So that might be, for example, showing them the pictures and saying, choose one, either your grandma or your grandpa, or you can choose your own. relative if you want to. I always provide pictures for my students just in case. They might not feel comfortable talking about family, or it may be that relatives aren't around anymore and it brings up sad memories. So I like to be prepared by having pictures just in case. So this would be the stimulus or the motivation, the reason why my students are writing. And then I would give them time to do the writing activity itself. Now, this is really important as well because you don't want to give the students a target amount. Writing is great to do in a lesson because it's a natural differentiating activity. So if I've got Mohammed and the best that I can expect out of Mohammed is 3 sentences in 10 minutes, that's fantastic. And then maybe I've got Fabienne, and in the same 10 minutes, Fabienne can produce a page and a half. That's absolutely fine because I'm going to be giving feedback to each student based on their individual level of progress. So if Fabienne, for example, only gives me a paragraph, I can look at her work and I can say, oh, come on, Fabienne, I think you can do a little bit better. Maybe add a bit more description there, or maybe add a couple of extra sentences there. So you can push the students according to their ability, but it's much better to give them an amount of time to fill, not an amount of paper to fill. Because if I said to Mohammed, fill a page, he'd be freaking out going, I can't do that. I'd much rather he get his 3 sentences perfect, and then the next time he writes, I can make sure that I'm praising and encouraging Mohammed to move from his 3 sentences maybe to a whole paragraph. And that way that I know he's making progress from lesson to lesson. So depending on the length of your lesson, you might want to include a follow-up task. So think about that because the students have all been working individually on their own writing task. It's probably been quite a quiet portion of the lesson, which is fine. It just means the learners are concentrating. But a good follow-up task could be getting the students to share what they've written with maybe 1 or 2 other people, and let the students decide who seems like an interesting character. So the students need to have a reason to read other people's writing. We're not just going to say read for fun or read for mistakes. We're going to make them read for content. Okay, so I've written about my grandpa. Oh, okay, you've written about your grandpa too. Let's swap stories. Let's see whose grandpa's the most interesting. Okay, and that might encourage a little bit of discussion as well, which is great just to balance out the quietness of a speaking lesson, of a writing lesson, sorry. So after the follow-up task, exactly the same as we did in the speaking skills framework, we then want to make sure that we're doing a little bit of content correction. In a physical class, you probably would have been going around and having a look at what the students are doing. Online, that might be more challenging because the feedback might need to be done in a lesson the following day once the students have either screenshotted or emailed a completed piece of work to you. You might want to select a couple of examples that the students can share their screens for you guys to look at all together, because again, you'll probably know within your class who are the good models to choose from. But this is more about the content that we mentioned. So, wow, your grandpa was in World War II. That's incredible. How many medals did he win? So you're acknowledging and validating, again, the work the students are doing for you. Or your grandma was a fashion designer. Wow, that's cool. Or she's got 1,700 pairs of spectacles. My goodness me, that must be a world record. Okay, so the students know that you are listening and they appreciate the fact that they've been heard, even though you've just been reading what they've been writing. And then you can do a little bit of work on the error correction or the language feedback. Again, not just correcting the errors, but if they've written quite simple sentences, maybe giving them a different connector. So, instead of using but here, why not try however? Okay, or why not, use as a result of instead of because? So we could be encouraging them to level up in the error correction portion of the activity. So if you follow the planning process using the stages of the framework here, again, this would easily be a 60-minute lesson, or you might want to choose to possibly include another reading task to make it detailed comprehension for them, and then only do the planning and the motivation in the lesson, and maybe do the writing as homework. And then the following day, you can do some work on feedback or content, depending on how often you see your students and whether or not you're working online or whether or not you're working in a physical classroom. Okay, so here are a slide of summaries of suggestions that we can do to help our students with writing. So remember, it's not about their creativity or their imagination. We're not testing that. It's their writing skills that we really want to develop. So pictures and prompts are your friends. Really work on building the confidence of the students and supporting them at the lower levels. So before you get them to write something, maybe get them to do a couple of parallel writing tasks first. Provide a model. That's normally a really good idea so the students can see what they're aiming for and they can do the parallel writing and then change the nouns or the adjectives or the activities, whatever it might be. Don't shy away from getting the students to write, okay, little and often. So maybe you could start a teacher Facebook page and have your students post there on a regular basis. Or maybe you can build activities into the class on a weekly basis instead of only doing writing once every 3 weeks. And as I mentioned earlier, make sure you don't give an expected amount, just time the writing, and then the students will automatically differentiate, and you can differentiate as well when you're error correcting. So with my imaginary students earlier, I might be heavier handed with Fabienne because I know she's of a stronger ability. And I might choose, for example, just to help Mohammed with his punctuation and his spelling rather than worrying too much about word order at this stage. The other important thing is making sure that you're supporting the students to become autonomous. You want to make sure they can function without you. So teach them how to edit and how to self-correct and how to proofread. So I might say, for example, to Mohammed, look, you always spell friends wrong. You get the I and the E the wrong way round. Maybe on the cover of your book, write the word friends. So next time you're doing a piece of writing, if you need to, you can go back and check how to spell it because I know you know the right answer. So you can give them specific things to look for that you know that they often miss. Maybe if I've got a Korean student, missing out the article might be really common. So forgetting to say that Seoul is a big city, for example. So if they know they're looking for that mistake, it becomes a lot easier for them to proofread and self-correct. So then some other ideas for writing lessons. Again, if you've got any questions about these, you can just pop them in the chat box in the forum. But writing stories from pictures can be really, really good. They can be a typical folk story, Aesop's fables, or a Disney story. A lot of people are familiar with the Frozen or Beauty and the Beast idea. And if it's something comforting and familiar, the students don't have to do any brain work on the story. The brain work can just be focused on the language. So that's quite important. Maybe getting them to write you dear teacher letters. So maybe like once every month, get them to say what was great about the lesson, what was your favorite thing about the lesson, what you found you most improved, or things that you really want to work with. And that not only gives them writing practice, but you get an insight as to what they're thinking and feeling about your lessons as well, which can be quite nice. Maybe there's a school newsletter or a school Facebook page, so getting the students to write little tweets or little posts might be useful for them. And also maybe writing to music. So playing some classical music and getting the students to answer questions like, do you think it's hot weather or cold weather where the music is playing? What kind of person could be listening to the music? What kind of clothes are they wearing? What activity are they doing? So the only limit really is your own imagination. And I really hope that you've enjoyed spending some time with me today. It's been my pleasure to chat with you through productive skills. So thanks very much. See you next time.